London, September 1888. The fog rolls through Whitechapel like a living thing, swallowing gaslight and footsteps alike. In these narrow streets, where desperation clings to every brick, where the scent of coal smoke mingles with human misery, something darker than poverty stalks the shadows. Bucks Row, 3:40 a.m. Police Constable John Neal's lantern cuts through the mist, casting dancing shadows against tenement walls. His breath forms clouds in the September chill as he makes his rounds through the labyrinth of London's forgotten streets. Something in the gateway ahead, a shape that shouldn't be there. Neal raises his lantern higher, and the light reveals what will haunt him for the rest of his days. A woman's body, throat slashed so deep, the wound gapes like a second mouth. This is not robbery. This is not a crime of passion. This is the work of something methodical, something that takes pleasure in precision. By dawn, the killer would have a name whispered in terror across London's East End: Jack the Ripper. But more than a century later, we may finally know who he really was. To understand the Ripper, you have to understand the world that created him. Whitechapel in 1888 wasn't just poor. It was a human warehouse where London's unwanted were left to rot. Picture this: 76,000 people crammed into a single square mile. That's more than twice the population density of modern Manhattan, but without running water, electricity, or proper sanitation. Families of 8 living in single rooms measuring 10 feet by 12. Children sleeping 4 to a bed when they had beds at all. The air thick with smoke from countless coal fires. The streets running with sewage and industrial waste that the Thames couldn't wash away fast enough. The mortality rate in Whitechapel was double that of London's West End. 1 in 4 children died before their 5th birthday. Life expectancy for working-class men was just 16 years, not because they died young, but because so many died as infants that it dragged the average down. For the women trapped here, survival often meant one desperate choice: selling their bodies for 4p, the price of a bed in a doss house. Not enough for food and shelter. Always a choice between hunger and the streets. The average woman in Whitechapel's unfortunate class lived only to age 35. But it was the geography itself that made this area perfect for predators. Whitechapel was designed as a maze, narrow alleys that twisted back on themselves, courtyards with multiple exits, passages so dark that even the newly installed gaslight barely penetrated. Dorset Street, where Mary Jane Kelly died, was known as the worst street in London. A single thoroughfare could house 1,200 people in lodgings that ranged from squalid to lethal. The police force was stretched impossibly thin. Detective Inspector Frederick Aberline's H Division had 575 officers to patrol 8.77 square miles. About 1 officer for every 130 residents. Most of these officers walked their beats alone, armed only with wooden truncheons and whistles. Into this perfect hunting ground, where vulnerable women walked alone through fog-choked streets, stepped a killer who understood exactly how to exploit every weakness, every blind spot, every moment of desperation. The press called it the Autumn Terror. They had no idea how accurate that name would prove to be. Understanding why killers choose specific hunting grounds reveals their psychological state. The Ripper didn't randomly select Whitechapel. He chose it because it perfectly matched his needs. Serial killers fall into 2 categories: organized and disorganized. The Ripper was highly organized, which means he planned extensively. Organized killers select victims and locations that minimize risk while maximizing control. Whitechapel gave him exactly that. The maze-like geography provided multiple escape routes, crucial for someone who needed to vanish quickly after each attack. The extreme poverty meant police presence was minimal and often ineffective. Most importantly, the social invisibility of his victims meant their disappearances wouldn't trigger immediate, intensive investigations. This reveals something chilling about the Ripper's mindset. He understood society's prejudice and exploited them. He knew that dead prostitutes in Whitechapel wouldn't receive the same attention as murdered ladies in Mayfair. This wasn't just opportunism. It was calculated predation that relied on social inequity. The Ripper's choice of hunting grounds tells us he was intelligent, patient, and utterly without empathy for society's most vulnerable members. He turned their desperation into his advantage. Before we talk about how they died, we need to talk about how they lived. Because Marianne Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly weren't just victims. They were women with hopes, with stories, with people who loved them. Marianne Nichols, Polly to her friends, was 43 years old when she died. Born in London to locksmith Edward Walker, she had married printer William Nichols at 19 and had 5 children. But alcohol destroyed her marriage. William threw her out in 1881, and she spent her final years moving between workhouses, sleeping rough, and selling herself to survive. On her last night alive, she was turned away from a lodging house on Thrall Street for lack of 4pence. "I'll soon get my doss money," she told the deputy keeper, touching the black straw bonnet she had acquired that evening. "See what a jolly bonnet I've got now?" She was proud of that bonnet. It was probably the nicest thing she had owned in years. Annie Chapman was 47, known as Dark Annie for her hair and complexion. Born Eliza Ann Smith, she had married coachman John Chapman and had 3 children. When John died of cirrhosis in 1886, Annie lost her small widow's pension and drifted to Whitechapel. She sold flowers and small trinkets to survive, moving from pub to pub with her basket, coughing from the chronic lung disease that left her increasingly weak. Her friends later said she'd been feeling unwell for days before her death, but she couldn't afford to stop working. "It's no use giving way," she told someone that final week. "I must pull myself together and go out and get some money, or I shall have no lodgings." She was trying to save money for her son's wedding. Elizabeth Stride had perhaps come the closest to escaping this life. Born Elizabeth Gustavsdotter in rural Sweden, she had come to London as a young woman and married carpenter John Stride. When he died, she received a small pension that kept her from the very worst poverty. She was trying to stay sober, trying to build something better. Friends said she was well dressed compared to others, that she kept herself cleaner, that she spoke 3 languages. On the night she died, she was seen laughing with a man near Berners Street, holding a packet of cashews, breath fresheners. For a moment, despite everything, she had found joy. Catherine Eddowes went by several names, including Kate Kelly, perhaps dreaming of a different identity. Born in Wolverhampton, she could read and write, unusual for women in her situation. She had lived with John Kelly for 7 years in what was, by Whitechapel standards, a stable relationship. She had been arrested for drunk and disorderly conduct on the night she died, but she charmed the police with her singing in her cell. They released her at 1 a.m. with a warning to see how you behave yourself. She laughed and promised to behave. "Good night, old cock," she called to the officer. An hour later, she was dead. And Mary Jane Kelly. Mary was only 25, young enough that escape still seemed possible. Born in Ireland, she had been married briefly to a miner named Davies who died in an explosion. She was considered beautiful, even in Whitechapel's harsh light. She spoke Welsh and told stories of growing up by the sea. She had lived in better circumstances once. There were stories of her working in high-end brothels in the West End. She had been planning to return to Ireland, she told friends. She saved a little money. She was going to start over. These weren't just names on a police report. These were women fighting to survive in a world designed to destroy them. Women who had loved and lost, who had tried and failed, who had hoped against hope, and someone decided they didn't even deserve that chance. Friday, August 31st, 1888, Bucks Row, now Durward Street, 3:40 a.m. Mary Ann Nichols becomes the first canonical victim, though she won't be the last. What shocked Dr. Reese Ralph Llewellyn, the medical examiner, wasn't just the violence, it was the precision. Polly's throat had been cut twice, left to right, severing the windpipe and major blood vessels with surgical accuracy. Her abdomen showed signs of deliberate mutilation, 2 deep cuts running from just below the breastbone. This wasn't a frenzied attack. This was controlled, methodical. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The killer had struck quickly and quietly. The body was still warm when PC Neal found it. Blood hadn't yet begun to congeal. Yet no one in the crowded tenements nearby had heard anything unusual. No screams, no struggle. 8 days later, September 8th, 29 Hanbury Street, the backyard of a lodging house, Annie Chapman. This time, the killer had grown bolder. Chapman's body was discovered in the backyard at 6 a.m. by John Davis, an elderly resident heading to work. The killer had done this in daylight, in a place where 17 people lived, where anyone might have walked in and found him at work. Yet he had taken his time. The mutilations were more extensive, more deliberate. Dr. George Bagster Phillips, the divisional surgeon, was visibly shaken by what he found. Chapman's uterus and part of her bladder had been removed with what he called anatomical knowledge, someone who knew exactly what they were looking for and how to get it. But it was the positioning that chilled investigators. Chapman's body was arranged almost theatrically. Arms at her sides, legs drawn up, personal items arranged around her like props on a stage. Her few possessions were laid out in a neat row. 2 combs, a piece of envelope, 2 farthings polished to shine. This wasn't just murder. This was performance. Phillips was so disturbed by the precision of the cuts that he refused to describe them fully at the inquest, saying only that they showed a great deal of knowledge as to the position of the organs. September 30th, the night that changed everything. 2 murders in a single evening, what the press called the double event. First, Elizabeth Stride in Dutfield's yard, just off Berners Street, just after 1 a.m. But something went wrong. Louis Deemschutz, returning with his pony cart from selling cheap jewelry at a market, startled someone in the darkness. His pony shied away from something in the gateway. Stride's body was still warm. Her throat was cut, but there were no abdominal mutilations, no careful arrangements. The killer had been interrupted at the moment of his deepest pleasure. So he moved. Less than an hour later, less than a mile away, Catherine Meadows was found in Mitre Square at 1:45 a.m., her body still warm, when police constable Edward Watkins discovered it. The killer had vented his frustration from the interrupted first murder on Catherine. The mutilations were the most extensive yet. Her face slashed in a pattern that suggested deliberate disfigurement. Her abdomen opened in a way that spoke of rage and precision combined. Her uterus and left kidney were missing. Gone. Taken as souvenirs. And in a move that proved he understood the power of psychological warfare, he left a message. A piece of Catherine's bloodied apron was found on Goulston Street, beneath graffiti that read, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." Sir Charles Warren, The Metropolitan Police Commissioner ordered the message erased before photographers could document it. His first instinct was to prevent anti-Semitic riots. It may have been their biggest mistake. November 9th, Miller's Court, Dorset Street. Mary Jane Kelly. This time, the killer had privacy. Kelly was murdered in her own room, a single chamber, 10 feet by 12, behind a door with a broken lock and windows covered by rags and old coats. When police finally broke in at 1:30 p.m., over 12 hours after the estimated time of death, they found a scene so horrific that Detective Inspector Abruptly, a man who'd seen everything Whitechapel could offer, was physically sick. The room had become the killer's private theater. He had spent hours with Mary Jane's body, dismembering it with what one detective called savage fury. The walls were splattered with blood. Body parts were arranged on the bedside table. Her heart was missing entirely. But perhaps most chilling of all, Kelly's clothing was found neatly folded by the fire, as if the killer had undressed her carefully before beginning his work, as if this had been intimate. After Mary Jane Kelly, the canonical Ripper murders stopped. Some say it was because he had satisfied whatever drove him. Others believe he simply moved on. But the question that haunts every investigator who's touched this case is simpler and more terrifying. What if he didn't stop at all? The progression from Mary Ann Nichols to Mary Jane Kelly reveals a killer whose psychological needs were escalating beyond his ability to control them. This escalation pattern is a hallmark of psychosexual serial killers and tells us everything about the Ripper's deteriorating mental state. Nichols' murder was brutal but relatively quick, throat cuts and minimal abdominal mutilation. This suggests the killer was still testing his boundaries, still learning what satisfied his urges. But it wasn't enough. Chapman's murder showed increased confidence and planning. The killer took more time, was more methodical, began taking organs. The theatrical arrangement of her possessions reveals someone who was beginning to derive pleasure from the act itself, not just the killing. The double event represents a psychological breaking point. When interrupted with stride, the killer's fury exploded onto Eddowes. This wasn't just making up for lost time. This was rage at being denied his psychological release. The facial mutilations of Eddowes were personal, angry, and vindictive. But Mary Jane Kelly represents the killer's complete psychological surrender to his compulsions. Hours of mutilation in private shows someone who had moved beyond quick satisfaction into extended ritual. This is the behavior of a killer who was no longer capable of controlling his urges. Criminal psychologist Robert Hare's work on psychopathy suggests that this level of escalation indicates a complete breakdown of whatever inhibitions the killer once possessed. The Ripper had moved from opportunistic killing to compulsive ritual, a progression that rarely stops voluntarily. So why did the murders end? Either the killer died, was imprisoned, or was somehow restrained by external forces. The idea that he simply stopped killing voluntarily contradicts everything we know about this type of escalating psychosexual violence. If the Ripper was methodical, the police investigation was anything but. The Metropolitan Police were facing something they'd never encountered, a serial killer who understood publicity, psychology, and precision in ways that Victorian law enforcement was completely unprepared for. Detective Inspector Frederick Aberline was a good cop, 25 years on the force, 14 of them in Whitechapel. He knew these streets like the scars on his hands, knew the people, knew their rhythms, their secrets. He could spot a pickpocket at 50 yards and find a fence in any pub from Aldgate to Commercial Road. But he was hunting something that didn't fit any pattern he'd seen before. The witness statements alone were a nightmare. Time estimates were wrong. Descriptions contradicted each other. Elizabeth Long swore she saw Annie Chapman talking to a man at 5:30 a.m., but Dr. Phillips estimated Chapman had been dead since 4:30. Albert Kadosh heard voices and a thud from the Chapman murder site, but thought nothing of it. John Richardson checked those same back steps at 4:45 a.m. and saw nothing unusual. Yet Chapman's body was found there less than 2 hours later. The descriptions were even more frustrating. Some witnesses described a well-dressed gentleman with a dark mustache. Others saw a rough working man with a fair complexion. Some said he was young, others old, short, tall, dark-haired, fair. The only consistency was inconsistency. P.C. William Smith saw a man with Elizabeth Stride at 12:35 a.m., well-dressed, carrying a parcel, about 28 years old. Israel Schwartz saw a different man attacking a woman he believed was Stride just 15 minutes later, shorter, older, wearing a peaked cap. Were these the same person? Different men? Reliable witnesses, or confused by darkness and fear? The investigation was further hampered by class prejudice. The police assumed the killer came from the criminal classes, someone local, someone who fit their preconception about who commits violent crime. They conducted mass arrests of anyone who seemed suspicious, anyone with a history of violence, anyone who couldn't properly account for their whereabouts. They arrested butchers because of the surgical precision. They arrested doctors because of the anatomical knowledge. They arrested immigrants because they seemed foreign and threatening. Then came the letters, hundreds of them, claiming to be the killer. The police received so many confessions and tips that they couldn't investigate them all. But 3 letters stood out, particularly the Dear Boss letter received on September 27th that first used the name Jack the Ripper. "I am down on horse and I shan't quit ripping them till I do get buckled," it read in neat, educated handwriting. The tone was mocking, almost playful. It promised more murders and signed off with "Yours truly, Jack the Ripper." 2 days later came the Saucy Jackie postcard, received the day after the double murders, claiming credit for the 2 deaths. Most modern experts believe the famous letters were hoaxes, created by journalists to sell newspapers. But in 1888, they had a devastating effect. The media had given the killer his iconic name and created the modern template for celebrity murderers. The investigation became a circus. The Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, led by builder George Lusk, organized citizen patrols. Amateur detectives pursued their own theories. Psychics offered their services. The press followed every false lead, every rumor, paying witnesses for exclusive interviews and contaminating potential evidence in the process. And through it all, the killer remained invisible. He struck when the streets were empty, vanished before help could arrive. In a city of 5 million, surrounded by potential witnesses, he was a ghost. For more than 130 years, Jack the Ripper's identity remained one of history's greatest mysteries. Countless suspects were proposed, books were written, theories were debated. But there was never enough evidence to prove anything definitively. Until now. In 2007, author Russell Edwards purchased a silk shawl at auction. The shawl was claimed to have been found at the Catherine Eddowes crime scene in Mitre Square, though its provenance was disputed. For years, Edwards worked with forensic scientists to extract and analyze DNA from bloodstains and other materials on the fabric. The results, published in the Journal of Forensic Sciences in 2019 and recently reinforced by additional testing, are remarkable. The DNA analysis showed 2 distinct profiles. One matched mitochondrial DNA from a living descendant of Catherine Eddowes, confirming the blood belonged to the victim. The other matched mitochondrial DNA from a living descendant of Aaron Kosminski. Dr. Jari Luhalainen, who conducted the analysis, stated, "The first strand of DNA showed a 99.2% match, as the analysis instrument could not determine the sequence of the missing 0.8% fragment of DNA. On testing the second strand, we achieved a perfect 100% match." But who was Aaron Kosminski? He was a 23-year-old Polish barber living in Whitechapel during the murders. Born in Kłodawa in Congress, Poland, he immigrated to London around 1881 with his family, fleeing the anti-Semitic violence that plagued Eastern Europe. He worked as a hairdresser, giving him access to sharp instruments and some knowledge of anatomy from shaving customers. More importantly, Kosminski was already a suspect. In 1894, Sir Melville Macnaghten, Chief Constable of the Metropolitan Police, wrote in his private notes that Kosminski was one of 3 strong suspects, describing him as a Polish Jew and resident in Whitechapel, with a great hatred of women, especially of the immoral class, and had homicidal tendencies. The DNA evidence also revealed physical characteristics. The killer likely had brown hair and brown eyes, which matches witnesses' descriptions from the night Elizabeth Stride was murdered. Israel Schwartz described seeing a man with dark features attacking a woman he believed was Stride. Most intriguingly, the timeline fits perfectly. Police records show that after Mary Jane Kelly's murder in November 1888, Kosminski's family began watching him constantly, never leaving him alone. If they suspected him, it would explain both why the canonical murders stopped and why he was never formally charged. Victorian families often handled mental illness privately, especially in immigrant communities already facing suspicion and prejudice. In February 1891, Kosminski was committed to Colney Hatch Lunatic Asylum after threatening his sister with a knife. Medical records describe him as suffering from auditory hallucinations and having a great hatred of women, especially prostitutes. He spent the rest of his life in asylums, dying in 1919 at age 53. As of December 2025, Edwards and his legal team are seeking a formal inquest to have Aaron Kosminski legally named as Jack the Ripper. The effort is supported by descendants of both Catherine Eddowes and Kosminski himself. Karen Miller, a direct descendant of Catherine Eddowes, told reporters, "The name Jack the Ripper has become sensationalized. People have forgotten about the victims, who did not have justice at the time. Having the real person legally named in a court would be a form of justice for the victims." The evidence supporting Kosminski as Jack the Ripper is compelling, but it's not without controversy. The case for Kosminski is strong. The DNA match, while based on mitochondrial DNA that can't uniquely identify an individual, is statistically significant. Dr. Luolainen estimates the odds of a random match at approximately 1 in 290,000. Combined with the fact that Kosminski was already a contemporary police suspect, the timing of his family's surveillance and eventual institutionalization, and the physical description match, the circumstantial evidence is substantial. His background also fits the profile. As a barber, he had access to sharp razors and some anatomical knowledge. His work would have made bloodstains on his clothing unremarkable. His immigrant status and mental health issues would have made him someone the police of 1888 might have suspected but struggled to investigate thoroughly. Most compelling is the behavior of his family. Something happened after Mary Jane Kelly's murder that made them watch Aaron constantly, then commit him to an asylum. If they suspected him of the Ripper murders, it would explain their actions and the sudden stop to killings. But there are problems with the Kosminski theory as well. The shawl's provenance is questionable. There's no documentation proving it was actually at the Eddowes crime scene. It could have been contaminated over the decades between 1888 and 2007. Critics point out that mitochondrial DNA analysis can only exclude suspects, not definitively identify them. More troubling are questions about Kosminski's capabilities. Asylum records indicate his English was poor. He preferred to speak Yiddish even after years in London. How could someone with limited English persuade native English speakers to follow him into dark alleys? The Ripper appeared to have detailed knowledge of Whitechapel's geography, but Kosminski lived with his family and wouldn't have had the freedom to wander extensively. Some experts remain skeptical. Dr. Alec Jeffreys, who invented DNA fingerprinting, has called for more rigorous peer review. Forensic scientists at Austria's Innsbruck Medical University have criticized the original study's methodology and conclusions. But perhaps most importantly, does it matter? The families of the victims and the suspect seem to think it does. If Aaron Kosminski was indeed Jack the Ripper, his background provides crucial insights into the psychology that created one of history's most notorious serial killers. Kosminski fits the profile of what criminal psychologists call a mission-oriented killer, someone who believed he's ridding the world of undesirable people. His documented great hatred of women, especially of the immoral class, suggests he viewed prostitutes not as human beings, but as symbols of moral decay that needed to be eliminated. His immigrant status adds another psychological layer. Kosminski came from a community already facing suspicion and persecution in Victorian London. This social isolation could have contributed to his psychological deterioration. Feeling rejected by society, he may have redirected his anger toward those he perceived as even more marginalized than himself. The timing of his family's intervention is psychologically significant. In traditional Jewish families, mental illness was often handled privately to avoid shame and potential persecution. The fact that his family began constant surveillance after Mary Jane Kelly's murder suggests they suspected him of something terrible. Kosminski's work as a barber is particularly relevant. This job required him to touch strangers intimately, holding their heads, positioning their necks, using sharp instruments near their throats. For someone with violent fantasies toward women, this occupation could have served as both a practice ground and a source of frustration. His deteriorating mental health, the auditory hallucinations, the threats with knives, the eventual institutionalization follows a pattern common in serial killers. Initial control giving way to complete psychological collapse. Most chilling is what this tells us about the murders themselves. If a mentally unstable barber could terrorize London for months, evade capture, and become internationally infamous, it suggests the Ripper wasn't a criminal mastermind. He was simply someone whose psychological breakdown occurred in the perfect hunting ground, at the perfect time, targeting the perfect victims. The horror isn't that Jack the Ripper was extraordinary. It's that he was tragically ordinary, a damaged man whose personal demons found expression in the worst possible way. Jack the Ripper killed 5 women in a span of 10 weeks in 1888, but his real victim was London itself, and the shadow he cast has never fully lifted. The murders fundamentally changed how police conduct investigations. They led to better crime scene photography, more systematic evidence collection, and the beginnings of what we now call criminal profiling. The Metropolitan Police began using bloodhounds for the first time. They started taking more detailed statements from witnesses. They began to understand that some murders were connected not by geography or opportunity, but by the psychology of the killer. The case also exposed the desperate conditions in London's East End, spurring social reforms that had been ignored for decades. The attention focused on Whitechapel led to improved housing, better sanitation, and efforts to address the poverty that made women like Polly, Annie, Liz, Kate, and Mary Jane so vulnerable. But they also birthed something darker, the modern obsession with serial killers. The Ripper was the first celebrity murderer, his crimes dissected by newspapers and devoured by a public hungry for sensational details. We created the template that we still follow today. The mysterious killer, the cryptic messages, the race between police and press to solve the case first. The victims, Polly, Annie, Liz, Kate, and Mary Jane, became footnotes to their killer's story. Their names are remembered primarily because of how they died, not how they lived. Even in death, the system that failed them in life found new ways to exploit them. That's why the recent DNA developments matter beyond simple historical curiosity. Karen Miller's quest for an official inquest isn't about sensationalizing Jack the Ripper. It's about finally centering the victims, about acknowledging that real women died, that they deserved better, that their families deserve answers. If Aaron Kosminski was indeed Jack the Ripper, he represents something we've learned about serial killers in the 130-plus years since Whitechapel. They're not the masterminds of popular culture. They're damaged individuals who exploit society's most vulnerable members. Kosminski wasn't a criminal genius. He was a mentally ill immigrant whose family suspected him enough to have him committed. The real horror wasn't the mystery. It was the system that made women like Mary Ann Nichols choose between hunger and the streets, that left Annie Chapman coughing her way through Whitechapel's markets for want of a few coins, that gave Elizabeth Stride hope just hours before it was extinguished. Even with the DNA evidence pointing to Aaron Kosminski, questions remain. Why did he take organs from some victims but not others? What did he do with Mary Jane Kelly's heart? Did he really write those letters, or were they all hoaxes? Why the escalation from quick killings to elaborate mutilation? Why Mary Jane Kelly? Why did he spend hours with her body when the others were killed quickly? And if Kosminski was the killer, what made him stop? Was it his family's surveillance, the increasing police pressure, or did he simply satisfy whatever compulsion drove him to kill? But perhaps the most important question is one we can answer. What have we learned? We've learned that monsters aren't born from fog and gaslight. They're created by neglect, by systems that abandon the vulnerable, by societies that look away when the inconvenient suffer. The real horror of Whitechapel wasn't Jack the Ripper. It was the conditions that made his crimes possible. We've learned that victims matter more than their killers, that the stories of these women deserve to be told, not as footnotes to their murderer's legend, but as complete human beings who fought to survive in an impossible world. And we've learned that science can reach across centuries to provide answers, to give families closure, to transform mystery into understanding. The fog has finally lifted from those Victorian streets. Whether Aaron Kosminski was legally declared Jack the Ripper or not, the most important declaration has already been made by the descendants who refuse to let these women be forgotten. Justice delayed is not always justice denied. In the end, the mystery that captivated the world for more than a century may finally be solved, not by a brilliant detective or a criminal mastermind, but by a strand of DNA and the determination of families who remember that real people lived, loved, and deserved better than the world gave them. This has been Deadly Intent. I'm Carman Carrion, and whether we finally know Jack the Ripper's name or not, one thing remains certain. The women of Whitechapel deserved better than their time gave them, and they deserve better than history has given them since. Science may have solved the mystery, but our job is simpler, to remember that behind every case, real people lived, loved, and mattered. Until next time, stay curious about the darkness, but never forget the light.